We respectfully acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering for diverse Indigenous people, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Den, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. For our keynote session, we are so honored to have with us Angela Bruce-Raeburn, who will be giving her perspective on race and privilege in the international development sector. Angela is currently serving as the Regional Advocacy Director at the Global Health Advocacy Incubator. Previously, she worked as the Senior Policy Advisor for Humanitarian Response in Haiti at Oxfam in the aftermath of the earthquake from 2010 to 2013. Angela was born in Trinidad and Tobago, grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and her immigrant experience has just driven her to choose a career where she would impact the lives of vulnerable people. She's an amazing writer. It's how I tracked her down. She's been writing for a while now about race, about privilege in the international development sector, and that's what she's going to be sharing with us today. Angela, we are so honored to have you here. I'm going to ask you to unmute and to start off our session.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Rumbi. So my name is Angela Bruce-Raeburn, and I just want to welcome you all to this virtual conference. And I'd like to start out by acknowledging that we are in a very unprecedented time. Many people that have zoomed into this conversation are probably zooming in from their home. Probably you're not in a place where your calendar had already scheduled you to be. But as a result of this pandemic, so many things have changed. I want to acknowledge that people are fearful. We're living in a time of economic uncertainty, and it's different. And for many of us, we've never lived through anything like this before. So before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that and to say that we realize that it is no longer business as usual. So when I got the email from the council, I had to do a little bit of research. I have to admit, I didn't know a lot about Alberta, didn't know a lot about Edmonton, but I found out two very interesting things. I found out that Edmonton is apparently the festival city of Canada, but I also found out something very amazing. And I found out that Edmonton Mall apparently is the largest mall in all of North America. And I have to say, Rumi, had I been there, you know that's where I would have been this afternoon. I have to admit that I'm sort of a mall connoisseur, and I would have definitely gone there. I heard there's a wave pool and there's a skating rink. I mean, that's an amazing mall. So my only regret is that I could not come to Alberta, so I could have gone to this mall. I would like to thank Rumbi Zinyimba. Thank you so much for tracking me down and inviting me. And I'd also like to thank the executive director of the council, Leah Urta, who I have not met, but we've met on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me present my perspective. So whenever you do these little, these little keynotes, you're always asked to perhaps tell a little funny story or a little anecdote, perhaps to, loosen up the audience, or maybe it's to maybe loosen up the speaker. I don't know which, but here's my little anecdote. So a few years back, I was a Rotary International Peace Fellow. And for those of you who don't know, you can check it out at Rotary. It's this international fellowship where you go to do graduate school in another country and you work on conflict resolution. So I was in Belgium and I was invited to a meeting of the Rotary Club, and it was in the Dutch part of Belgium. So I get there, it's 5:30 in the afternoon, it's Europe, so we're having some wine and everybody's talking and asking me questions, and everyone is just, lovely to me, and it's going really well. About 10 minutes to 6, I realize the weirdest thing. There are no women in the room. So I'm feeling a little weird now, and I'm thinking, are all the women late for a meeting? I mean, it seemed weird to me, but I thought that. So about 10 minutes to 6, 5 minutes to 6, the president is like, ding, ding, ding. He calls the meeting to order. I sit next to him. And now I'm thinking, wow, all the women are late to this one meeting. How weird is that? And so I lean over to the president and I say, I don't understand. Why are all the women late? And he said, oh, we don't have any women, Angela. We are, we're one of those clubs that after Rotary changed to allow women to come in, that we don't have to, we were grandfathered in to keep, to not have any women. So of course, I thought I was hilarious. So I turned around and I said, what do you mean, no women? Who's gonna do all your work? Needless to say, I thought it was hilarious, he did not. And so whenever I think about this story, I always remember the unamused face of the president of Rotary. But on a serious note, I want to talk to you today about a few things. I want to talk about race. I want to talk about power and privilege. I want to talk about international development and how all of that is coming together in this period of time, a time where, as Rumi mentioned, we are in a racial justice conversation globally, a time of a pandemic, a time of economic crises. And all of these dynamics are coming together in a very specific way, but in international development, in the sector where we work on helping vulnerable people, the impact is great. I want to start talking about a little bit about aid too. And for those of you who could think back to 2018, when we started talking about Me Too, Aid 2 was just sort of the next iteration. It was just the thing that people referred to when we wanted to talk about some of the issues of misconduct, racism, sexual misconduct, bad behavior that happened in the international development community. And Aid 2 was designed to kind of also throw in other issues, questions around diversity, questions about how we work in other people's countries, questions about how we treat local people and how we work with them and treat them with dignity in their own homes. While Me Too has exposed misconduct, it has exposed bad behavior in the tech sector, in Hollywood, in media, of course in politics, but it also had an impact in international development. What Aid 2 demonstrated was that in the doing good sector, in the social impact sector, that we were not immune from some of the bad behaviors. In fact, what we saw was that this doing good sector was perhaps more susceptible to these kinds of bad behaviors, because this is the sector where we meet people who are vulnerable, people who are living in complex times in their own countries. And so it seemed that we were recognizing that the nature of development, how development is given and how development is received, had a huge impact on how these issues of misconduct and bad behavior and racism, how they all came together. In addition, Aid 2 had an even more significant impact. It opened a window for us to talk about global development. It opened a window for us to talk about the things that we didn't want to talk about. And one of the things that we did not want to talk about was race. It was a shock for us to talk about race, because for years, the international development community did not want to talk about race. It was easier perhaps to talk about gender, because maybe people felt more comfortable discussing issues of gender than they were in talking about issues of race. But as a result of the opening of the window that came from the Me Too movement, all of a sudden, race was front and center. What Aid 2 also did was it shone a spotlight It brought the glare of the media. It was not really a story about corruption or, the regular stories that we deal with aid. We always talk about corruption of funds and misuse of money, but what Aid 2 did, it changed that conversation a lot. Because at the end of the day, let's be clear about what aid organizations are about. Aid organizations and donors have been reluctant. In fact, some of them have been adamantly opposed to placing a focus on race and racism in the aid sector, especially because donor countries are often quite proud of their giving. And in fact, people assume that that means that there's no racism in aid. But the simplicity of this belief merely places the blame of bad behavior on, a few bad apples. But if you focus on the few bad apples, meaning those organizations that you've heard a lot about who have had issues of, some misconduct, if you focus on that, you miss the underlying systemic problems in international development. You allow the underlying systemic issues in international development to go unchallenged. But if you think about it, isn't the idea of aid rooted in a racist construct anyway? I mean, think about it. Rich countries have been able to create this massive, out of control industry of helpers, do-gooders, and those people who just love Africa, or those people who just love the Caribbean, or whatever part of the world that people feel needs help. Inherent in the very notion of aid is race and racism. Because only in this system can majority white societies with ample resources determine what poor Black and brown people need, how much they need, set up the parameters to deliver what they need, and then create an elaborate mechanism to evaluate if they spent what you have determined that they needed. So think about it. Think about this huge system where all these pieces of it are done oftentimes outside of these countries that people are interested in working in, right? So I wrote this op-ed, and it was a few months ago. It may have been published in DevX, and I was just saying that the aid sector was deeply racist, sexist, lacking in diversity, and completely unaware of itself. Because what we accept as legitimate in the aid sector are developed countries, their modalities, the way developed countries do everything, right? And then we impose it on recipients in poor countries. And then we send expat people to these countries to make it all happen. We are convinced that their capacities need to be built. We are convinced that they need to be taught by us. We are convinced that we need to empower them. We go to these countries as though these countries are a clean slate, as though nothing ever happened before. Nothing ever happened before we arrived. There was no slavery, there was no colonialism, there was no apartheid, there were no atrocity crimes, just nothing. So we arrive in these countries with our policies, our ideas, our plans, our strategic plans, our log frames, our metrics, all of our strategies that we have decided is what these countries need. But interestingly enough, all these strategies that we come with are developed in New York, in DC, in London, and yes, even in Edmonton, Alberta. Who are the recipients of this aid? Mostly Black, mostly brown people, people who look like me. I remember I was on a flight. I was going to Haiti. It was 2012. And almost half the flight were older white Americans dressed in like these bright t-shirts, and it had the name of their state. It might be Ohio or Nebraska or Arkansas or something like this. And it had their churches or their missions, and they were on the plane, and they were almost half of the flight. So remember 2012, that's 2 years after, going into 2 years after the earthquake. So lots of things happening in the country. And they were coming to Haiti so they can help. And I was wondering at the time, what is it that makes a person wake up in the morning, fall out of bed, and say, I am going to a foreign country to build things. I'm going to build a school or schools. I'm going to build a hospital. I'm going to build a house. I'm going to build things in these countries. Because my question is, well, were you invited? Did you meet with the mayor of the town that you're going to? Did you meet with the government of the country that you're going to? Did you have meetings with people in these local areas, these villages, and to ask them, well, what is it that you need? Like, where do you get the notion that one can just go into these places and just do all kinds of things? These people that I met on the plane, I was curious. So I asked them when the plane landed, and they said they were going somewhere in the country pretty far away from Port-au-Prince, and they were going to build a school. And whilst that sounds great in theory, I wondered about, well, what language are we going to be teaching the children in? Where are the teachers going to come from? Where are the books going to come from? What happens when the funding runs out? Who's going to take up the school when you're done? Like all these questions that people don't seem to have an answer to when they get on a plane and go to build things in someone else's country. And without a connection to the government, you have to ask questions about that, because these people at the end, when the school closes and there's no more money, they do harm, right? So that's why it matters to ask these questions. So if this feels uncomfortable to people listening, I can say to you that it's way more uncomfortable when you are in one of these little towns and you see a half-built school and you ask, well, what happened? And then you hear, well, the money ran out and nobody came back to finish the school, or the books ran out and we have no more books, or the teacher can't teach, and all the other small, and then maybe they're not so small. But these are the issues that have to be dealt with when you're talking about working in other people's countries, and there's this sense that you can just go there and do whatever you want. In the period of time, and let me just give you some numbers so that you can kind of get a picture for how sometimes development aid operates. Many of you watch the news and you hear things like, after the earthquake, we were going to give 100 million. And then you hear $1 billion, and you hear 200 million and 200 billion. And people in these countries, in developed countries, in Canada, the US, the UK, people say things like, wow, we're just giving away so much of our money to foreign aid, right? Because people think that it's a lot. But many of you know that what is allocated is not necessarily disbursed, right? So let me just give you some numbers about how we were operating in Haiti after the earthquake. In the period of time after the earthquake, less than 3% of all the donor funds that came to the island nation went to the government. So think about what that means. Less than 3% of all this money that you heard about went to the government. Let me give you some more numbers. The UN Special Envoy for Haiti reported that of the overall $2.4 billion pledged, which was about 34% of that, which was about $864 million of those funds were given back to the donor organizations, civil society organizations in the donor countries, and also military organizations. So think about that. So you hear this big, 2.4 billion, and you think $2.4 billion going to Haiti, well, it's actually not that number, right? Another number that might be interesting, 28% of, that's about $672 million was given out to UN organizations and non-governmental organizations that were not located in Haiti, right? So big NGOs get a lot of this money, okay? So I'm telling you this because I want to kind of explain some of these numbers that you hear and realize that all this money don't just flow into these countries. That is not how it works. A lot of it goes into the international development sort of apparatus, and that's where a lot of the money stays. And very little of this money is able to be trickled down into the country, right? So let me give you this. From 2010 to 2012, efforts to assist post-earthquake Haiti mostly benefited, or at least subsidized, the aid and relief institutions and private corporations that appointed themselves helpers. And I say appointed because just like the people on the plane, you're coming into these countries, half of them don't speak the language, and don't even get me started on the fact that everyone says, well, Haitians speak French. Well, actually Haitians speak Creole. And while some people in the country speak French, the majority of the people in the country speak Creole. So even that understanding of what happens in these countries are just not, there's no care placed on that, right? So when you have this giver-receiver relationship, you come with your bias, right? You come with your understanding of what the outcomes should be. You come prepared to say, we're going to fund this, we're going to fund that. But what if that's not what is needed or what people really want in their communities? When you bring your money, you bring your bias, and we act as though there is no history, that we came to these countries with a clean slate, that international development is something that just happened sort of in a vacuum. So after the scandals of A2, we had to start talking about, can we reimagine aid, right? And the reason why we started talking about reimagining aid is because many people were appalled when they heard of some of these scandals that was going on in places like Haiti and other parts of the world. People were upset. And many people were incredulous. They were saddened and hurt. And when I say that, I'm talking about international organizations and lots of civil society people were concerned about some of these levels of racism and all these allegations of misconduct that we saw all over the news. But you just can't lament and be sad if you want to get at the root of the scandal. You got to ask questions about power. You have to ask, what are the power structures in the international development sector that gives rise to these kinds of imbalances, these kinds of opportunities where people come in the country, organizations just have a strategic plan, they go in, they just go to whatever part of the country they're working in, they figure it out, and then they don't know really what the country needs. There's no real relationship built with the government. So you have to ask the question, why is that the case? And it's about power, and it's about privilege. Nowhere in this power structure is this power imbalance more clear than in international development. And so people have been asking, so what should we do? How can we make this better? Well, it's simply not enough to hire a equity and inclusion director, because it seems as though that's our new answer to everything. We have new voices, we have this new thinking around it, and we're saying, what are we going to do? How should we get better? And so here's some suggestions from someone who works in the sector, someone who has always seen the power imbalances that happen because you have people coming from outside and they're creating their own ideas. So let me give you an example of some things that I've seen. When I was in Haiti, there was once an opportunity. I had a meeting with some staff, and the expat director was giving her she put out the agenda, and she put on there that she wanted the meeting to start at a certain hour. And I got to the meeting and I realized that the meeting didn't seem to start on time. And so when I asked her why it seemed so that we weren't starting at the time that she appointed, the expat director said to me, I put an earlier time because the Haitian staff are always late. And so I said to her, so you make up the meeting time? I mean, what do you mean? But what she wanted to do was to say, people are always late. And so instead of thinking of how to discuss and analyze that question, she decided to, because she had the power, she was an expat, she was in charge, she was able to make that decision. I thought that a better option would have been perhaps to have meetings start later, because I was thinking, if the person in that office who was in charge was a Haitian person, that person would have had the wherewithal to know the complexity of transport in the country during the earthquake. That person would know that the roads were completely damaged. That person would know that the stoplights and all those things to flow traffic was completely ruined. That person would also know that many of our staff lived very far away from the office. A Haitian person in that power position would have known more specific information that would allow a better decision to be made. That would be a better decision for the staff. But when you have expat people with power, and they're coming with more than just power, they're coming with their elite education that may be gotten in London or in the US or in Canada or in Australia or wherever. They're coming with higher salaries. They're coming with a lot that the people in country don't have. So this person is able to make a very big decision that impacts people. Now, some people might say, well, Angela, that's not, it's an innocuous little thing. But I say it's not innocuous if a policy was created that impacts the people in country. And those are just little microaggressions maybe, but they have a policy impact. And this is one of the areas that I feel in international development, we have got to change. We have got to move away from this notion that foreign people, they come with all the knowledge, and we have to start to think about these people in these countries in which we work and how those people are going to be able and have to be able to lead in their own country. It's their work, it's their country. They know it better than we do. And oftentimes we spend a lot of time talking about, empowering and building capacity and all these things that frankly, we can't do. We can't do it. This notion that we're going into some parts of Africa and some parts of the Caribbean and we are going to empower, those people have a way more empowered than us, than me, in many, many ways. And I feel like part of the sort of the system that has been built around this notion of white saviors, right? That, white people come to countries and they become experts. They know more about the country than people in country. Their opinions are more valued. They're in the meetings, in NGO, in these meetings, these people are the ones who everyone seems to think that they are the ones who have all the expertise. And I say, if we're going to get better in international development, and if we're going to be able to walk away at some point from these countries, we have to change this paradigm, this notion that we have answers. So just some closing thoughts about how we're going to reimagine this. We need new voices. We need different voices. We need diverse voices. We need even discordant voices. We need people who don't subscribe to this idea that people in these countries are sitting waiting for development to come to them. That these people have no agency over themselves. So I'm speaking to people in the audience who are executive directors and people who are sitting at the leadership table. Here's a couple things for your role, what your role must be. Learn to make space for voices other than your own. Move away from the notion that your organization or your mission is to empower anyone. People in these formerly colonized or occupied countries do not need your empowerment. Bring an ethic of care to your organization's mission. So how can you do this? You know, many of you have sat on those country calls. I'm sure many people on this call right now have sat on those country calls, and we get on the call and it's all business. You know, where, you know, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? But you need to also realize that because people are on the receiving end of aid does not diminish their humanity. It does not diminish who they are and what they are living currently in these countries. So ask about these countries. Ask them what their everyday lives are like. If aid is to be transformative, then aid must be a tool for governments to provide the needs of their citizens. To reimagine aid is to put on a different lens, to step outside of the typical people in our networks, people who graduated from the same school as we did, people in our immediate little circle. Aid recipients and people in these local contexts, they must lead the way. They must tell you what you need. You can't create a country strategy in Canada and assume that this country strategy is going to work when you get on the ground in some of these countries. Learn to make room for voices that are outside of our own. Because this is going to be one of the ways that we're going to be able to transform aid. One of the things that we have not done well is to be inclusive. When we talk about these people coming into countries, it's always the same kind of people, right? There's no real concerted effort to broaden the circle. I say that when I am in places like Haiti, I'm a Black woman, I'm from the Caribbean, I feel vested in what happens in a country like this. I feel connected. And I'm saying that when we start talking about how we're going to operate in some of these countries, we need to put people in these places first. They're the ones that have to tell you what to do. They're the ones that have to tell you, this is what we need. What you think they need may not be what they need. And learning how to accept that. And I know what some people are thinking, because I know that the other side of the argument is, oh, people are corrupt in some of these countries, because that's also the go-to narrative, right? That it's, that the reason why we do this is because of corruption. And I say, I understand that. But I also say, look at how we have operated in many of these countries for the past 60 years. Some organizations have been in Haiti, in places like Haiti and all over the world for 40, 50, 60 years. I meet people who are proud to tell me that they have been working in a country for 50 years, 60 years. And I'm curious to ask, so are you ever going to leave? Are you ever going to would the work that you have done ever be good enough so that people in country can do the work without you? Or is it the plan to always be in these countries? Is it the plan to always have these expats living? Or are we ever going to work ourselves out of a job? Because I remember that when I was in Haiti in 2010, I remember the go-to mantra was, we're going to work ourselves out of a job. It has been 10 years, and I'm not sure how many people actually have worked themselves out of a job. So I ask you, as I want to just close this and open it up to people to ask questions, challenge that. I feel like we are in a place now where we have to ask about race, reimagining international development, and the place that, and what is the role of race in the way we think about development? Because it's not benign in many ways. Because at the end of the day, where are the people in the countries what countries are we in? We're all in countries where formerly colonized or occupied countries, where the people are mostly Black and brown. And where does the majority of international aid come from? It comes from countries like Canada, the US, the UK, and that kind of thing. So there is a racial component that we have pretended has not existed for years. So I ask you now, how do we reimagine it? And I think that we imagine it by opening the development circle, moving away from these specific schools where people come from, and walking into these countries with an open mind to ask questions about what is needed, to connect with the government in a way that you have to know what is the government priority. Oftentimes we say, and then I'll end, oftentimes we say, oh, you know, we connected to the government, but it's window dressing. If the statement, if the numbers that I gave about less than 3% of all the development aid going to, that went into Haiti, less than 3% went to the government, that to tell you that the government is not a priority. And so much of the development after the earthquake was to be done by the international community. How is that sustainable? So I'm gonna end there, Remy, and we could talk. How am I doing on time? Bad?
You did great. We're right on time. Thank you.
Okay, okay. So if we could go through some questions if you would like from me.
Absolutely. Angela, thank you so much for that address, and for starting off our conversation on this hard topic, but very necessary, as you have said. We have 112 people in our Zoom session right now, and some questions have been coming in. But to just wrap up what you've been saying, Angela, you know, my takeaways from what you've said is, you know, we need to open the development circle. And I think that's a new way of saying that I've heard from you. Who is in the development circle? You know, when we're at a development drinks, development dinner, who's around the table, and how do we open that up? Representation matters is what I got from you as well. Who we send overseas matters. Who's in the rooms when we create our partnerships also matters. And my last takeaway is just a rethinking and a relearning about what empowerment means, which is the theme of our conference, you know, relearning. Instead of thinking of going to empower people, how can we start from a point of view of people are already empowered? Where is that power, and how can we see it? So
how can we pull it out? How can we pull it out?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that.